I thought it was junk mail at first, just another envelope in the sea of bills, ads, and political flyers cluttering my apartment floor. But the envelope was thick, sealed with black wax pressed by an unmarked insignia. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, handwritten in old-world cursive, like something out of a Victorian spy novel. Inside was a letter unlike anything I'd seen before. The parchment smelled faintly of burnt edges and aged leather, and the ink shimmered like obsidian in the light. It read, "You've spent your life studying history's shadows. Now it's time to walk through them. You have been chosen to witness 24 hours in the presence of the most feared and infamous criminals the world has ever known. No rewinds, no edits, just you, the truth, and time." Beneath it, coordinates, latitude and longitude pointing to an address that didn't exist on any modern map. And at the bottom, history doesn't hide its monsters. It builds statues for them. I should have thrown it away, should have laughed and carried on with my safe lectures, coffee-fueled nights, and tidy footnotes. But something in me, something starved for more than textbooks and archives, felt a tremor. I needed to see history not from behind glass but from its bleeding heart. By sundown the next day, I was at an abandoned Victorian library, swallowed by vines and time. Hidden in its basement was a vault, a cold, humming chamber filled with what looked like military-grade neural tech. A woman in a gray coat greeted me without introduction. "You're late," she said. "Strap in. They don't wait." I sat in a chair that pulsed beneath my spine, was handed a headset and injected with a stabilizer. As my vision blurred, a final whisper came through my earpiece. "This isn't time travel. This is time remembrance. You won't change anything, but you won't forget anything either." And with a flash of blinding light, I was gone. The first thing I noticed was the cold. Not just temperature, but a biting dampness that clung to the skin like guilt. London, 1888. I was in Whitechapel, one of the city's poorest, most dangerous districts. The air smelled of coal smoke, urine, and despair. Horses trudged through muck. Children darted barefoot between puddles. Prostitutes leaned against walls, under flickering gas lamps, eyes tired from hunger and fear. And then there was him. He walked slowly through the narrow back streets like he belonged to the shadows. Dressed in a long overcoat and bowler hat, gloves tucked tightly, eyes alert but hollow. Jack, if that was even his name. He didn't speak, didn't smile, just moved with surgical precision, scanning faces. But it wasn't random. He was studying, calculating, choosing. I followed him in silence, invisible yet sickened by proximity. He trailed a woman, a pale-faced middle-aged sex worker named Annie, judging by what the pubkeeper had called her earlier. She didn't see him. Or maybe she did, but chose not to care. Hunger dulls the senses. He waited until the alley narrowed, until the fog thickened, until the sounds of the street vanished behind a brick corner. And then, it was fast, efficient, silent. A gloved hand around her throat, a sharp blade glinting once in the gaslight. She gasped, barely able to scream before she collapsed. Her life left her body before she hit the ground. He leaned over her, not frenzied, but focused. A.E. Butcher more than a madman, what he did next. I turned away. I couldn't watch, not even as a ghost. When I finally dared to look again, he was gone. Not running, just gone. The woman's body lay crumpled, discarded like street trash. And as the morning's first drunkard stumbled out of a nearby pub, I realized something horrifying. No one would come for her. No one would even notice until the sun came up. In this city, women like Annie were invisible in life, and even more so in death. The newspapers would turn her into a headline. The city would whisper about the monster in the mist. But the real terror wasn't just Jack. It was the silence of the people, the apathy of the authorities, and the truth that evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it walks quietly, smiling, unnoticed. The cold damp of Victorian London faded into heat, jazz, and cigarette smoke. Suddenly, I was in 1920s Chicago, alive with neon lights and back alley deals. The jazz age was in full swing, but beneath the glittering surface lay a dangerous heartbeat: bootleggers, corruption, power traded in bullets and bribes. I stood outside a speakeasy camouflaged behind a barbershop, one of Al Capone's favorites, I was told. Inside, it was all red velvet and brass. The band played loud, the gin flowed like water, and laughter echoed over whispered deals. Then, the room shifted. The air thickened. Capone walked in. Shorter than I'd imagined, but every step carried the weight of a man who knew he owned the room. Men stood. Women smiled with red lips and cautious eyes. He wore a pinstripe suit and a diamond pinky ring that caught the chandelier light like a knife. He moved to a private table near the back and sat like a king on his throne. I followed, though invisible. He laughed easily, joked with waiters, and tipped absurdly large, playing the role of Chicago's benevolent prince. Then the facade cracked. A runner whispered something in his ear. Capone's smile vanished. A name was mentioned. A rival, someone who had disrespected his territory. Without blinking, Capone raised a hand. No words, just a nod. A death sentence, sealed over bourbon and blues. I followed the hitman out the back, watched as the order was carried out, brutally, efficiently, and in silence. One moment a man was smoking under a streetlight. The next, he was bleeding on the sidewalk. That was Capone's power. Violence so sudden, it barely registered before. It was done. When I returned to the club, Capone was laughing again, arm draped around a showgirl. He had the charisma of a movie star and the soul of a warlord. He wasn't just feared, he was admired. Chicago didn't just tolerate Capone. It needed him. During Prohibition, he gave people what they wanted: liquor, jobs, protection. And, in return, they turned a blind eye to the blood. I looked at him, this man who signed death warrants with grins and cigars, and realized he wasn't a madman. He was a businessman, but his business was built on corpses. Darkness fell like a stone. I awoke in the thick walls of a castle, cold, vast, and echoing with silence. Torches lined the halls, flickering against tapestries that depicted battles, saints, and blood. I was in Choctaw Castle, Hungary. The year was 1609, and I was about to meet one of history's most feared women, Countess Elizabeth Bathory, often whispered about as the real female Dracula. I was led, or perhaps pulled, through her corridors by some unseen force. The room smelled of rose oil and something darker, something metallic and cruel. Noblemen and maids scurried silently. No one met my eyes. Even in memory, fear lingered like perfume. And then I saw her. Elizabeth stood near a mirror, brushing her. Jet black hair, wearing a crimson gown that shimmered like blood in moonlight. She was beautiful, ageless. But her eyes, those cold, searching eyes, held no warmth, no light. She spoke softly to a servant girl, who trembled with each breath. The girl had a cut on her hand, and Elizabeth's gaze lingered on the blood. With eerie fascination, I followed her through hidden doors into a chamber I wish I had never seen. Shackles, whips, iron instruments I couldn't name. She moved among them like an artist admiring her tools. They say she believed bathing in the blood of virgins would keep her young. I don't know if that's true, but I watched her with terrifying calm instruct her servants to hurt another girl who had merely spilled water on her gown. What haunted me most wasn't the cruelty, it was the indifference. She inflicted pain like others might clip flowers. She didn't scream, she didn't laugh, she simply did. And yet, in the great halls of her estate, nobles still dined with her. Priests still blessed her lands. She was a widow, a woman of power in a man's world, and she used that power to prey on those below her, peasants, orphans, maids who would never be missed. History would later question whether she truly committed all the crimes she was accused of, or if politics and fear painted her darker than she was. But I had seen enough to know. Real evil wears a calm face. When I left her castle, the torchlight dimmed behind me, and I felt something shift in my chest. I wasn't just watching history anymore. I was bleeding from it. Suddenly, I was thrown into a world of salt air, thunderous waves, and the creaking timbers of a massive wooden ship. The Queen Anne's Revenge, I realized, as the black flag flapped overhead. I had entered the Caribbean Sea in 1718, in the age of pirates, but not the romanticized kind. This was the floating empire of Edward Teach, the man the world feared as Blackbeard. He stood at the helm, towering, wild-eyed, and wrapped in leather belts and pistols. Smoke rose from the slow-burning fuses woven into his braided beard, creating an aura of dread and sulfur around him. He wasn't just a pirate. He was a living nightmare, engineered to terrify. But what struck me most wasn't his brutality. It was his performance. Blackbeard was a master of fear. Every movement was calculated, theatrical. He didn't just raid ships. He staged invasions. His eyes locked onto each sailor as he boarded their vessels, his silence more deafening than any war cry. The men dropped their weapons, many begging for mercy before the first shot was fired. He rarely needed to kill. His legend did it for him. Below deck, I walked past barrels of gunpowder and stolen gold, past enslaved Africans shackled in silence and fear. The smell was putrid, of sweat, rot, and hopelessness. One of his quartermasters whipped a young sailor for hesitating to obey. Blackbeard passed by, barely glancing, but his presence alone silenced the screams. He ruled not with justice, but with awe. Later, as the storm began to rise, I found myself in his private cabin. Skulls adorned the walls. Maps, marked with blood, and rum stains littered the desk. He spoke to no one, just stared into a candle, whispering names I couldn't understand. Perhaps they were enemies. Perhaps they were victims. Or maybe just ghosts that never stopped visiting him. By the time the British Navy cornered him months later, he would go down with his ship in a blaze of gunfire and blood. But tonight, he was very much alive, and I realized the secret to his reign. Blackbeard wasn't feared because he killed. He was feared because he made men imagine what he might do. That's what made him immortal. The roar of the sea faded, and the chill of St. Petersburg invaded my bones. I found myself standing in the candle-lit halls of the Winter Palace, under chandeliers dimmed by war and desperation. Russia was crumbling under revolution, and yet all eyes, noble and common alike, were fixed on a peasant from Siberia, Grigory Rasputin. He entered the drawing room barefoot, robes dragging, his beard wild like frostbitten moss. People around, him, duchesses, bishops, military leaders, seemed to shrink in his presence. He was not handsome nor clean, but his eyes, icy, unblinking, pierced like daggers into your soul. I couldn't look away. No one could. Rasputin spoke like a prophet, slow and hypnotic. He murmured prayers over the Tsarevich Alexei, the hemophiliac son of Tsar Nicholas II. The boy had been writhing in pain moments before, but now, in Rasputin's presence, his suffering calmed. Whether it was spiritual power, manipulation, or pure coincidence, I could not say, but I felt it. The room shifted around him. Reality bent. Behind closed doors, I witnessed darker things. Whispers of orgies, drunken visions, and political blackmail. Noble women confessed sins to him in candlelight, then kissed his feet. Men who once laughed at him now obeyed him like sheep. He promised healing. He promised divine visions. But what he offered most was certainty, something Russia desperately lacked. In private, he leaned over a glass of wine and spoke aloud as if to me. The strong are not those who lead armies, but those whose voices echo in the heads of kings. And his voice did echo, loudly, in the ears of the Tsarina Alexandra, who believed Rasputin was sent by God to save her son and Russia. She clung to him, even as her empire unraveled around her. When he was assassinated, poisoned, shot, and drowned, he refused to die. That night I watched from the shadows as conspirators panicked, their bullets seemingly useless. His blood ran black, his eyes wide even as he finally sank beneath the ice. A myth, born in a swamp, died in a palace. Rasputin wasn't evil in, The traditional sense. He was chaos wrapped in robes. And in a crumbling empire desperate for miracles, chaos found a throne. The hot wind hit my face like a slap. Dust whirled in the air, and an old Ford V8 came roaring down the highway, torn tires spinning across sunburned concrete. I was now in Depression-era Texas, where dreams were cheap and bullets were cheaper. The car skidded to a stop, and the doors slammed open. Out stepped Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, young, reckless, and beautiful in the way tragedy often is. Bonnie, with her wavy hair tucked under a beret and a pistol hidden in her purse, looked more like a poet than a criminal. Clyde, thin and twitching with tension, had the worn face of a man who'd lived 10 lives by 25. They spoke in hushed tones, laughed over nothing, kissed like the world was ending, and maybe for them, it always was. I sat invisibly in the back of their getaway car as they sped toward another robbery. The radio crackled with music and police chatter. Their fingers interlocked over the gear shift. Bonnie read her latest poem aloud, the story of Bonnie and Clyde. Her words soft and rhythmic, like she already knew her ending was written in fire. When they reached the bank, they moved like clockwork. Clyde stormed inside. Bonnie kept watch, hand on her revolver. They didn't want to kill, but they were prepared to. The manager stuttered over the safe code. A guard flinched. One shot, just one, and the room changed. Clyde didn't blink. They left with $300 and a trail of chaos. Back on the road, Clyde's hands trembled. Bonnie leaned over and kissed his temple. "We'll make it out," she whispered. He didn't answer. In that moment, I saw what America didn't. They weren't folk heroes. They were desperate kids, running not toward fame but from a country that had abandoned them. The papers painted them as monsters. The truth? They were broke, cornered, and too in love to stop. As they drove into the setting sun, I realized why people rooted for them. It wasn't the crime. It was the rebellion. In a world that took everything, Bonnie and Clyde chose to take something back, even if it cost them their lives. Rumbled like thunder. I was now in Medellin, Colombia, a city caught in a vice grip of power, terror, and unthinkable wealth. And at the center of it all sat a man who ruled not with a crown, but with cocaine. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria. I found myself inside La Catedral, the luxurious prison Escobar had built for himself. It was more resort than cell. Pool tables, saunas, imported chefs. Gold-framed portraits of saints and machine guns adorned the same room. He walked barefoot across Italian tile, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The prison guard stood at attention, his men. This wasn't incarceration. It was negotiation. Escobar greeted priests like old friends, hugged cartel, lieutenants like brothers, and kissed his daughter on the forehead with hands that had ordered thousands of deaths. He was soft-spoken, calm. That's what made him terrifying. He spoke about justice, about taking care of the poor, about the gringos who demonized him. Yet the bodies piled up in rivers. That day, he invited his family for lunch. The meal was extravagant. Steaks, fresh arepas, imported wine. But just 2 miles away, a neighborhood lay in ruins from a car bomb planted by his rivals, or perhaps by Escobar himself, in a game of power so convoluted, even the dead stayed confused. Pulled me aside, or perhaps he sensed me. He looked through me and said softly, "They call me a monster, but what is Colombia without me? Who gave them homes? Who gave their children medicine? The government? No. It was me, Pablo. I am not the devil. I am what they created." But outside the mansion's gates, I saw another side. Wives sobbing at morgues, children orphaned by crossfire, priests delivering last rites to victims of narco-justice. Pablo built schools with one hand and burned villages with the other. I left La Catedral with my throat tight. Escobar wasn't just a criminal. He was a god and a ghost, a man who reshaped a nation with blood, power, and illusion. In his world, morality was a myth, and the only law was fear. And still, in the poor barrios, people whispered his name with reverence. Because for them, Pablo gave more than he took, until he didn't. Everything changed. No sound, no city, no scent of gunpowder or blood, just darkness. Then, a soft blue glow. I found myself in a cramped apartment lit only by LED strips taped to the ceiling, the faint hum of cooling fans whispering like ghosts. Walls were lined with servers stacked like towers. Screens flickered with endless code, satellite feeds, and open bank portals. A lone figure sat hunched in front of it all, their face hidden under a hoodie, eyes reflecting nothing but scrolling data. No name, no flag. The world's most wanted hacker, but to me in that moment just a shadow. This was a new breed of criminal. No blood on his hands, no stolen gold in his closet. His weapons were lines of code, and his battleground was everywhere. In one window, he silently drained the offshore accounts of an arms dealer. In another, he exposed the dirty secrets of a pharmaceutical giant. Then he erased an identity, a woman fleeing an abusive husband now free because of him. I wanted to think he was a hero. But then I saw the other feeds. A hospital server in Nairobi was frozen mid-surgery. A gas line rerouted into a school in Ukraine. A politician's affair leaked, ending not just a career but a life. There was no moral compass, only power. Unchecked, unfeeling, godlike power. He sipped coffee, typed, laughed at a meme, and in seconds caused more global chaos than any terrorist with a gun. Not for revenge, not for ideology, but for fun, for curiosity, for control. He never left the room. He didn't need to. I leaned in, desperate to understand him. On one of the screens I saw a live stream of myself, sitting in this simulation, watching him. He turned his head, slightly, toward the camera. His lips curled into a smirk. "There is no such thing as privacy anymore," he said. "And if you think this is history, you're already behind." Then everything glitched. The lights blinked, and I was gone. I awoke with a scream caught in my throat. The chair beneath me was cold again. The underground vault hummed quietly. The woman in gray stood before me, not with a clipboard or a smile, but with eyes that had seen this reaction before. No words, just a nod. My time was over, but I was not the same man. 24 hours ago, I thought I knew crime. I had studied it, wrote essays on it, lectured on it with the safe distance of academia. But I hadn't felt it. Now I had smelled it on the Ripper's coat, laughed beside Capone's charm, watched Escobar play God, seen blood drip from a countess's chalice, and stared into the face of a hacker who didn't believe in consequences. Each of them had worn different masks: fear, power, love, legend. But beneath them, all had made the same choice: to take what they wanted, no matter the cost. History had immortalized them not out of respect but out of obsession. History had immortalized them not out of respect but out of obsession. We put their names in books and their faces in films, not to honor them, but because we fear what they reveal. That every civilization grows from the cracks between morality and survival. And that monsters aren't born, they are built, loved, followed. As I stepped out of the vault and into the sunlight, the world felt quieter, but not safer. Because now I knew the truth. History doesn't forget its criminals. It studies them to prepare for the next one.